Ever hear an old song or see an old actor and instantly transport yourself back in time? For kids of the 70s, it was probably an all too familiar feeling. Today, we're deep diving into 30 shows from the 70s, which time has probably long forgotten, as well as most of the people. From the Bugaloos to ISIS and Speed Buggy to Space Academy, stay with us as we talk about some iconic shows of the age. Land of the Lost. Saturday morning science fiction at its finest. Land of the Lost followed the Marshall family, who after a wilderness accident found themselves transported back in time to the age of dinosaurs. A precursor to Jurassic Park, this one featured sci-fi writing royalty in the shape of David Gerrold, who any sci-fi junkie would know as being involved in Star Trek, the original series. With someone like him on board, you can guess what sort of writing to expect. But unfortunately, Land of the Lost didn't last that long and then became extinct. The Tomorrow People. At some stage or another, we've all thought that we were superior of intelligence to our friends. This show featured characters who actually are. This British sci-fi series was about a group of teenagers who represented the next stage in human development with skills like telekinesis and telepathy. It was kind of like the British version of the X-Men, featuring some nifty camera tricks to pull off all of the superpowers. H.R. Pufnstuf. Anyone who likes a bit of surrealism should check out H.R. Pufnstuf. The story follows Jimmy, who found himself stranded on a living island. But what's so weird about that? Well, everything's alive. The trees, the houses, the clocks, and everything can talk. There are rumors that thanks to the trippy style of H.R. Pufnstuf, it was inspired by the 1960s counterculture movement. It's probably not that much of a stretch, considering the fact that it aired at the end of the decade. The Bugaloos. And if you liked H.R. Pufnstuf, you should check out The Bugaloos. It was the very same people, brothers Sid and Marty Krofft. The Bugaloos followed insect-themed teenagers who lived in a magical forest, constantly battling with their arch-nemesis, Bonita Bazaar, who wanted nothing more than to steal their musical talents. It's said that the Bugaloos were based on a psychedelic version of the 60s icons The Monkees, and it followed the pattern of the Kroffts and their writing style. Shazam! Before the market was saturated with superhero movies and TV show spin-offs, there was Shazam. It followed the hero, Billy Batson, who, having been chosen by mystical elders, harnesses the capability to transform into none other than Captain Marvel. All he had to say was, Shazam, and then his transformation took place. It was actually one of the first shows that incorporated a positive message and a lesson for kids, giving it the moral appeal that parents enjoy in kids' shows today. ISIS. Also known as The Secret of ISIS, it ran in conjunction with Shazam. It even featured crossover episodes as part of the Marvel Universe, with the two superheroes appearing on each other's shows. ISIS followed Andrea Thomas, a high school teacher who discovers an ancient Egyptian amulet that gives her the powers of the goddess Isis. As if that wasn't cool enough, ISIS was also the first live-action TV show to feature a female lead, and was way ahead of its time. Sigmund and the Sea Monsters. Another Sid and Marty Krofft entry, Sigmund and the Sea Monsters featured a couple of brothers who befriend a sea monster named Sigmund. But Sigmund has one problem. His family expects him to be a big bad sea monster who scares people, when deep down he's a big softy who just wants to be loved, and the boys keep him out of the clutches of his mean family. Sigmund actually stood out from other Krofft shows, as it featured a laugh track, giving it a more traditional sitcom feel. Speed Buggy. The main star of this show was an actual dune buggy type car that was named Speed Buggy. The Hanna-Barbera production featured Speed Buggy and his three human companions, who travel the world getting into races and other kinds of hijinks. The gang would regularly stumble across villains and crime and get themselves into high-speed adventures, relying on Speed Buggy to save the day. It was actually a near-identical copy of Scooby-Doo when it came to the formula, with a talking car instead of a big dog. The title character was voiced by Mel Blanc, the same man who is legendary for voices like Daffy Duck and Bugs Bunny. The Skatebirds. Another Hanna-Barbera program, this hybrid live-action animated show followed three bird hosts who served as comedic anchors. The idea was to create a roller skating-themed program that followed along the lines of Banana Splits. Despite its short-lived success, because it turned out to be blending multiple themes was more tricky than first thought, the Skatebirds did spawn Mystery Island from one of its segments, which was then repackaged into its own standalone show. Jabberjaw. Who doesn't love a 15-foot talking shark that plays the drums? Jabberjaw featured our fishy rock star and his bandmates, who traveled to other underwater realms where they regularly found themselves going head-to-head with a local evil scientist/villain. In what may be seen as a shocking turn, the personality of Jabberjaw was actually modeled on comedian Rodney Dangerfield. Do you remember Jabberjaw? Let us know in the comments down below. Genie. A genie named Genie? You couldn't make it up. Genie followed Corey, who discovered a beautiful red-haired genie named Genie, whose sidekick Baboo arguably steals the show via bumbling attempts to help. It was actually based on the hit show I Dream of Jeannie, but it instead featured a teenage protagonist. Interestingly, Baboo is also voiced by none other than Joe Besser, once a member of the Three Stooges. Baboo would become a favorite of Hanna-Barbera characters and would return periodically to make cameo performances over the years. The New Adventures of Gilligan. This animated version of the classic Gilligan's Island would follow the same storyline, featuring all of the main players from the show, Gilligan, the skipper, and the rest of his ragtag crew. Gilligan's clumsiness and the crew's inevitable failure to be rescued featured front and center, with plenty of fun to be had along the way. What you may not know, however, is that most of the characters from the original actually returned to voice their animated characters. Lidsville. Yet another Croft Brothers production, Lidsville followed Mark, a boy who falls into a magician's hat and then finds himself in a magical land inhabited by talking hats, which seems surreal if you ask me. But don't worry, there is a friendly genie named Weenie on hand to assist young Mark, whose main focus is on escaping the clutches of an evil magician named Horatio J. Hoodoo, who may have just moved to number 1 on the spot of best names today. Lidsville was actually inspired by Alice in Wonderland, but instead of playing cards, they had hats instead. Far Out Space Nuts. If you're a fan of slapstick comedy, you have to check out Far Out Space Nuts. Another Croft production, Space Nuts followed 2 NASA workers who don't quite hold the required mental capacity to work for the world's premier space agency. After being accidentally launched into space, the pair have to figure out a way back to Earth while simultaneously encountering strange extraterrestrial beings. It features longtime Croft collaborator Bob Denver in the lead, which is a winning combination. Korg 70,000 BC. Any fan of Saturday morning 70s kids shows would surely have this one in their top 10. The show followed the title character of Korg and his family, who faced challenges like hunting and protecting themselves from wild animals. While it was intended for children, it was also aimed for a semi-realistic portrayal of what it may have actually been like to live during the prehistoric period, which doesn't really seem like a heap of fun. This one was actually narrated by Burgess Meredith, whose name movie buffs may recognize from Batman and Rocky, where he played the Penguin and Mickey. Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle. Unlike previous incarnations of Tarzan, what set Filmation's version apart was their version of the title character actually being a thoughtful and intelligent hero, as opposed to the brutish strongman that he was previously portrayed as. We follow the hero as he battles against poachers, gnarly jungle inhabitants, and the occasional supernatural threat, all in order to protect his jungle habitat. Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle was the first animated version of Tarzan and actually stood out for its immense storytelling and detailed backgrounds to the delight of children around the world. Wonderbug. Another Croft Brothers production, Wonderbug featured a live-action segment from the Croft Super Show and followed 3 teenagers who come across a beat-up old dune buggy. They soon figure out that when they attach a special horn, the old dune buggy transforms into Wonderbug, who has an uncanny ability to root out bad guys while taking immense care to not expose itself as a simple old dude buggy. Wonderbug speaks via a series of honks and beeps, kind of like a 4-wheeled R2-D2. Electra Woman and Dyna Girl. Imagine being a child of the 1970s without the Croft brothers. This one followed a pair of crime-fighting female news reporters who were equipped with a high-tech wrist device and kept an array of villains at bay. Electro Woman and Dyna Girl was heavily influenced by Batman with its use of colorful villains and almost made a comeback in the early 21st century, but never happened. At the risk of the list turning into a Croft love letter, and in answer to the earlier question, I couldn't imagine being a child in the 70s without the Crofts. Godzilla. Another Hanna-Barbera effort, this animated show followed Captain Majors and his crew, who manned the deck of the Calico, a high-tech research ship sailing Earth's oceans. Of course, there were plenty of dangers lurking about beneath the surface, but the crew have a secret weapon. That would be Godzilla himself, who they can summon whenever they like through their special signaling device. What separated this one from previous versions was the fact that Godzilla was actually a protector and not the destructive savage that people were used to seeing. It simultaneously softened his image for the younger viewers. Inch High Private Eye. Inch High Private Eye followed a private detective who, as the title would suggest, possesses a magical formula enabling him to shrink to just an inch in height. Handy if your line of work means you have to sneak past a criminal. With the help of his niece, her boyfriend, and their dog, Inch High solves cases while also managing to annoy his tightly wound boss, Mr. Finkerton. You may remember Inch High making later cameos in other Hanna-Barbera productions, despite the short-lived show itself. The Pink Panther Show. Arguably one of the most well-known shows on this list, The Pink Panther defined a generation of cartoon kids of the 1970s. Initially born out of the 1963 Pink Panther movie, the animated show followed the protagonist as he outsmarted numerous bungling criminals in often bizarre situations. The beloved character was famed for his laid-back attitude and limited speech, where you would be surprised at how little the animated sleuth actually spoke. He then spawned off multiple spin-offs, TV shows and video games, and more towards the end of the 20th century. The Barkleys. An animated sitcom that followed the lives of human-like dogs, the Barkleys followed Arnie Gruff, his wife, and 3 children as the family navigated the perils of everyday life. Humorous and relatable, the show tackled issues of the day and has been suggested by later TV critics that the Barkleys actually serve for the inspiration for later family-centered animation shows like The Simpsons and Family Guy, though admittedly a little less inflammatory than the latter. Mumbly. 1970s animated shows featured a plethora of canine detectives. Mumbly was a trenchcoat-wearing dog detective with a wheezy laugh that used slightly unorthodox methods to outsmart his foes in a slapstick comedy style. Due to the obvious parallels with Muttley from Wacky Races, there was a conspiracy theory going around that the two were actually the same character. However, Hanna-Barbera officially ruled that theory out, informing viewers that Mumbly was a detective in his own right and not a simple sidekick. You may also remember him as a repurposed villain who popped up in the Laugh Olympics in the late 70s, but before then he was a good guy. Curiosity Shop. Produced by ABC, this was a full-on educational program for children and served head-to-head as a rival of the 70s staple kids show Sesame Street. The show followed 3 inquisitive children, Gerard, Cindy, and Ralph, as they explored a magical shop and its contents. They learned about things like science, history, and geography in a fun way, which was a lot more exciting than 70s classrooms. Despite the short run, the show made a lasting impact and served as a blueprint for later shows like Bill Nye the Science Guy. Space Academy. Another Filmation production, this live-action sci-fi show was set in the future in 3732. It followed cadets of the Space Academy who had to use teamwork, telepathy, and advanced technology to solve cosmic mysteries, all while being confronted with the dangers that lurk in distant galaxies. For its time, the special effects used in Space Academy were viewed as groundbreaking, but today it obviously looks dated. You can't judge it by today's standards because they did their best with what they had. Battle of the Network Stars. Popular TV actors competing against each other, what's not to love? This one put stars from various networks against each other in a kind of gladiator-style battle of endurance. Obstacle courses, swimming races, and tug-of-war battles were the order of the day, but arguably the most iconic moment of the show came when Linda Carter of Wonder Woman fame challenged the $6 million man Lee Majors to a foot race. The Bay City Roller Show. With the Bay City Rollers at the height of their fame in the mid-70s, they decided to cash in and create a musical variety show of sorts. The show featured the band playing their hits, but also engaging in pretty questionable comedy routines. It was all in good fun, though. Aimed at their teenage fan base, it was produced by Sid and Marty Krofft. There wasn't a whole lot done in the 70s that didn't have their name. Space Ghost. While technically not the 70s, the animated superhero show followed the protagonist as well as his teenage sidekicks Jan and Jace, who of course brought along their pet monkey Blip. Who doesn't love a pet monkey? As you may imagine, it was set in space and saw action-packed space battles, a must-watch Saturday morning staple for youngsters of the era. Strangely, the character was reborn decades later, featuring in a bizarre late-night comedic talk show called Space Ghost Coast to Coast. Jonny Quest. Another mid-60s show, Jonny Quest followed a fearless 11-year-old who traveled the world getting into and out of some pretty hairy situations. With his father, their bodyguard, and Johnny's half-brother with their dog in tow, the gang blended dangers that range from sci-fi, lost civilizations, and futuristic technology around an espionage narrative James Bond would be proud of. And speaking of James Bond, it's thought that the show took some inspiration from the British secret agent, often making it feel like a more real-life adventure than an animated series. Speed Racer. Speed Racer originally began as a Japanese anime series and followed a young race car driver and his car, Mach 5, in a high-stakes race around the world. Of course, there was the obvious villain to navigate past in each episode, and an interesting subplot that involved Speed Racer's mysterious older brother, Racer X. Speed Racer is often credited with being one of the first Japanese anime shows in the United States, paving the way for the meteoric rise of anime in later decades. What did you think about these forgotten television shows that only kids of the 70s would remember? And did you ever watch any of them? Make sure to let me know all about it in the comments section down below. Subscribe to the channel so that you never miss another great video like this one in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.